The palace of the last king of Poland. Once, Poland had been the center of the largest commonwealth in Europe, but by the 19th century, the kingdom had ceased to exist. It had become the rump of three alien empires. In territory occupied by the Russians, the Tsar called in Cossack troops to quell rebellions in 1830 and 1863. Thousands of Poles were driven into exile or imprisoned. In the 20th century, two men epitomized the struggle for independence. The Polish socialist Józef Pilsudski drew inspiration from the past and plotted rebellion against the Tsar. The Polish nationalist Roman Dmowski believed that Catholicism and reconciliation with Russia were essential to build a modern Polish nation. At the end of the 16th century, Poland was ruled by noblemen who elected their own king. They had extensive freedoms and a glorious military tradition. But during the 17th century, Poland began to disintegrate. By 1795, Poland's neighbors had torn the nation apart. A 20th century lantern slide of Tsar Nicholas II, head of an empire that stretched from the borders of Germany to Japan and the Americas. Nicholas II believed his autocratic rule had divine sanction. He reigned supreme over 130 million people from more than 100 different ethnic groups. In 1905, the Russian Orthodox Church called on the Tsar's loyal subjects to defend the empire from the Yellow Devils. The Japanese emperor, the Mikado, had sent his troops to seize Manchuria from Russia's domain. A startled world saw early moving pictures of the Japanese army marching its way to victory. The Russo-Japanese War has been described as the first modern war. Weapons of mass destruction were proved efficient. The Tsar's defeat spurred dedicated Russian communists like Lenin and Trotsky to foster strikes and rebellions. In Poland, Rosa Luxemburg echoed the call for international revolution. For Józef Pilsudski, it was a chance to promote Polish independence.
I had to reply to questions about the geography of Russian Empire. But then suddenly, the door of a classroom opens, in which appear two young men who started shouting, "Children, down with Tsarist Russia, down with Tsar Nicholas."
We two sisters were in the room we shared with my mother. We were already in bed, but not quite asleep, expecting my mother to come in. Meanwhile, the maid came and took her nightdress, a toothbrush and hairbrush. We asked if mother was not coming back that night. "Your mother is at the town hall." This meant she'd been arrested. She was under arrest for 2 or 3 days, then released. Others were detained longer. What I remember, of course, was that it was all tied up with the question of Poland.
I remember how everybody at home was careful not to antagonize the porter. And because he was well aware of the clandestine meetings in our apartment.
The whole administration, so-called civil administration and military and post and everything was under Russian command.
Of course, vodka has quite a lot to do with the softening of the character of the porter, but still there was always that hidden fear. Will he say to the gendarme or not that there were those meetings in our apartment.
I pamiętam,
I remember that there was a revolution, that there were fights, and that a bomb exploded somewhere near the Wiedeński station.
For almost a year, Polish socialists organized widespread strikes and protests.
The strikes collapsed at the end of 1905, crushed by force, military force everywhere. Thousands of people were arrested, hanged, sent to Siberia.
The failure of the revolt, the third in less than 100 years, brought fresh debate about ways of achieving Polish independence. Józef Pilsudski became a bank robber for the cause. His political opponent, Roman Dmowski, derided such gestures. His National Democratic Party gathered strength. They had opposed the strikes, calling them hooliganism, which harmed the chances of Polish autonomy under the Tsar.
He said, I want to talk to the Russia and tell them that if they want peace in the Russian part of Poland, they must give us autonomy, complete political autonomy, because we are trusted, you see, by the population, and you will have peace in this part of your empire.
After the events of 1905, the Tsar established Russia's first parliament. A constitutional manifesto offered limited political rights and freedom of association. Though still primitive by Western standards, the Tsar's domain experienced rapid economic growth and social change. The Tsar remained head of the Russian Orthodox Church. He let millions of Jews suffer oppression. In the Ukraine, the Uniate Church was persecuted. Polish Catholics were suspected of disloyalty. In 1907, the Tsar was invited by his distant cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, to inspect the new Imperial German Navy. Russia's 19th century ally in subjugating the Poles had become the most powerful nation in Europe. Germany had a mighty army, an efficient bureaucracy, and some of the most dynamic industries in the world. German investment had poured into Silesia, making it the most developed area of what was once ancient Poland. The industrial wealth was controlled by the Germans. Poles were hirelings, denied even their language. Prussian military tradition, German scholarship and capital, united under a gold-helmeted emperor, bent on keeping Poland vanquished. Europe's longest-serving emperor, Franz Joseph of Austria-Hungary, ruled the southern part of Old Poland. Aging and eccentric, Franz Joseph had a loyal army and kept up an alliance with the German Kaiser. Franz Joseph allowed his subjects, including Poles, Ukrainians, Jews, and Czechs, considerable political freedom and autonomy. His Polish lands, renamed Galicia, included the ancient Polish capital of Kraków. Kraków remained a haven of Polish learning. As they had done for centuries, Jewish traders and artisans eked out a living. But by the 20th century, Galicia had become one of the poorest parts of Europe. More than 2 million people had fled poverty and emigrated. 80% of the population were impoverished peasants. But it was in Galicia that Polish culture and history were kept alive. In 1386, the marriage of Poland's 12-year-old queen to a duke from Lithuania created a commonwealth of tolerance, learning, and strength. Polish armies beat the Turks, Muscovites, Swedes, and Tartars. In 1410, they triumphed over the Teutonic Knights at Grunwald. 500 years later, concert pianist Ignacy Paderewski led the anniversary celebrations.
We shall not yield our forebears' land. Our nation is Polish, and Polish our folk.
I was brought up in the climate of big patriotic feelings, and everything actually was geared toward one aim, that maybe one day Poland will regain the independence and we will be one nation again.
In 1910, Franz Joseph permitted Polish military traditions to be rekindled. The Austro-Hungarians hoped the Polish Riflemen's Association would provide useful military reserves. The riflemen were led by the now legendary Józef Pilsudski. Pilsudski had become a military strategist, clandestine publisher, and political visionary.
He was that unearthly phenomenon suddenly taking form and inciting us, encouraging us with his supreme charm of persuasion to do things which seemed above us in our sane moments.
In February 1914, Pilsudski predicted that the three empires ruling Poland were about to collapse.
War is unavoidable. What's important for us Poles is that for the first time since the partitions, the Germans will fight the Russians and vice versa. Do you realize how big it is, our chance now?
On June 28, 1914, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, paid an official visit to Sarajevo in the Balkans. The area was seething with nationalist discontent. The Archduke and his wife were assassinated. Austria-Hungary blamed the new Serbian state. Russia mobilized her army in support of Serbia. Germany mobilized in support of Austria. It ended in World War. Imperial Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire went to battle against a former ally, Nicholas II. The Tsar blessed his army and vowed never to surrender. Russia's ally, France, entered the war against the Kaiser. Once the German army moved west, Britain, too, was at war. Seizing the initiative, Pilsudski transformed his Riflemen's Association into a fighting force under Austrian control.
I wanted Poland, who had forgotten the sword since 1863, to see it flashing in the hands of her own soldiers.
Claiming to represent a Polish national government, Pilsudski took 400 troops into Tsarist-occupied Poland and called for an uprising. The population ignored him. Pilsudski was forced to retreat.
It pains me too much, the brutal truth, as to the weakness and slavishness of my own nation, which sedulously sought dependence on and obedience to foreigners. In 1914, when war burst upon the world, the Polish cause was not included amongst those for which men went out to shed streams and rivers of blood.
Two million Poles fought in the armies of their conquerors. Poland, the meeting point of three empires, became a killing ground, drenched with blood, swarming with troops and refugees.
Next to our train was the Red Cross train, and because it was a hot summer night, all the windows were lowered. I could hear the mourning and the cursing and yelling of the wounded soldiers in the Red Cross train, and it was a terrible, terrible thing to listen to. And my father even told me, look, hurry up and close the window so your mother wouldn't hear it.
We're kept apart, my brother, by a fate that we can't deny. From our two opposing dugouts, we stare each other in the eye. In the trenches filled with groaning, alert to the shell fire's whine, we stand and confront each other. I'm your enemy, you are mine.
Nieszczęsna Polsko, cóż doczekała.
Unhappy Poland, what fate has befallen you?
Minęły czasy, chwile.
Gone are the times and moments of peace. King has declared war upon king.
Że nie pługi,
It's not plows that till the Polish soil, but guns and bombs. These shells bring death and destruction to villages and towns. Now I see the vision clearly, caring not that we'll both be dead. For that which is not perished shall rise from the blood that we shed.
The Polish National Democrats and Roman Dmowski supported the Tsarist war effort, claimed the Tsar.
Poles, the hour has struck. Under the scepter of the Russian Emperor, Poland will be reborn, free in her own faith, language, and self-rule.
Within a year of war, however, the Tsar was retreating from Warsaw. Hoping to secure advantages for Poland, Roman Dmowski now traveled to France, England, and the United States. Josip Pilsudski continued to fight against the Tsar. He recruited saboteurs.
I joined the underground movement, which was called the Polish Military Organization. And in that, there was a special mobile unit created towards diversion against the Russians. We would have a stock of arms, and we would look after these arms. We would fake documents. Women had quite a lot of work, which was quite dangerous.
Pilsudski's 21,000-strong Polish legions fought in an uneasy alliance with the Germans and Austrians.
Pilsudski and Polish Legion, it was a daily topic of conversation. All the other events, whether they were reports from the Western Front or from the Italian front, one way or another, they were interpreted from a point of view of the Polish future.
On the 5th of August 1915, the Germans took over the city of Warsaw from the Russians. Thousands of Poles were members of the German armed forces. Prince Leopold of Bavaria took the salute.
Eigentlich merkte man das wenig, kein Hass zwischen ihnen.
There was no hatred between the Poles and the Germans.
Während des Weltkrieges nicht.
There was too much suffering then.
Da mussten ja die Polen,
The Poles also had to go to war.
Und es war eben nur das Leid.
Every
In
family
jeder Familie,
suffered.
In jedem Haus war ein
In every house there was a son to be mourned.
Und das hat eigentlich überwogen.
The pity of shared suffering prevailed.
Mitleiden, ja.
In November 1916, in territory seized from the Russians, the Germans established what they called the Kingdom of Poland. It was a phantom state. There was no monarch. The kingdom's task was to support the German war effort. Despite misgivings, Pilsudski became a military leader in the puppet kingdom. His tactics and opportunism provoked dissent.
He was like a man near breaking point. He was having quite a tough time. First, internal trouble with Polish people who were of different opinions, and then the fight with the Germans and the Austrians. So he had two things weighing on him.
Pilsudski had foreseen a great war, which would topple the Romanov dynasty. His premonition was fulfilled. In February 1917, the Russian army and people ousted the Tsar from power. In Russia, thousands of Poles joined in the celebrations.
No carat upadł, znaczy wolność.
The Tsar had fallen. This meant freedom. We went out on the streets of Moscow singing patriotic songs like The Day of Blood and Glory.
To dziś dzień krwi i chwały, wszystkie. Ta lutowa...
The February Revolution and the fall of the Tsar was something very joyous. Then came the time of Kerensky. He loved to talk, and talked a lot. We were a little under his spell. He promised Poland independence.
Soon another Pilsudski prophecy came true. For 3 years, the American Congress and President Woodrow Wilson had kept the United States out of the war. Hoping to act as a mediator, Wilson appealed for peace without victory. But the Germans stepped up their war at sea. They planned an alliance with Mexico and Japan. On April the 6th, 1917, Wilson declared war on Germany. By July, Pilsudski and most of his Polish legions had withdrawn their support for Germany and were imprisoned. Whilst they were interned, Europe took another lurch into the unknown. In Russia, Lenin's Bolsheviks had seized power. Kerensky's Russian government became a footnote of history. The Bolsheviks, too, promised freedom for the submerged nations of the Tsar's old empire.
1917 is a year most important for the development of the First World War in general, but especially for Poland. In 1917, Russia suffered the second revolution, and in fact was plunged in the revolution to such an extent that it ceased to be counted as an ally of the Entente powers.
After the collapse of its Russian ally, France embraced the notion of Polish independence with vigor. Pilsudski's old foe, Roman Dmowski, had persuaded the Allies to form a Polish army in the West. From France, Canada, and America assembled more than 50,000 Polish emigrants who hoped to march into Poland with the advancing Allied armies. But Dmowski and the troops were still in France when Germany sued for peace. The Germans released Józef Pilsudski from prison. He returned by train to Warsaw to forge a new Polish state.
It began exactly on November 11, 1918, when we, schoolboys, members of a secret military organization, were mobilized in order to disarm German units, which at that time occupied town of Częstochowa, where I was a pupil in local high school. Well, that's the first time I got a gun. You know. And these German soldiers from whom I took this gun was very kind to me and told me, look, I have enough of this instrument, and now you may take it.
Washington, D.C., November 1918. Americans celebrate the end of a world war. President Wilson, leader of the most powerful nation on earth, left the United States for a Europe that lay in ruins. The war had claimed approximately 15 million lives. Wilson was determined that such a catastrophe would never again cloud the earth. He planned to form a League of Nations, pledged to the rule of international law. His principal allies would be the British, led by Prime Minister Lloyd George, and the French, headed by George Clemenceau. Clemenceau and all the Allied leaders favored the creation of a new Polish state. But what sort of Poland? Czechs, Germans, Lithuanians, and Ukrainians all sought territory the Poles claimed as theirs. In Lvov, there was bloodshed.
I approached the young Ukrainian officer and I asked him what's all that shooting about. And he told me, well, there's nothing about except that this is now our land. This is Ukrainian Republic.
We received news that Ukrainians organized a kind of uprising in the city of Lvov, which was Polish and with a great tradition in our history. It was one of the frontiers town, always exposed, to attacks by Tatars, by Russians and so on.
Our home and our family was unfortunately on a Ukrainian part of the city, next to the old Austrian fortress called Citadella, and we were too darn close to it, and because of that unpleasant neighborhood, we were getting all kind of bullets from Ukrainian side and from Polish side as well.
I approached very close to this window and I saw on the floor more or less 10 people sleeping. So I prepared my iron. It was very heavy, a so-called defensive hand grenade. It was burst, all these windows went out, and I think either these people were killed or wounded, but two managed to escape, with guns in their hands, looking for enemy. So, as I was instructed, I shot them.
My father never showed any emotion. He was too, I don't know how to describe it, but he was very, very stingy in showing his emotions. And that particular day when I yelled to him, "Daddy, Daddy," the whole Lvov is in Polish hands. He didn't say a word. He just unarmed me, gave me a big hug, and this was the first and the last time in my life when I saw him cry.
Of course, we both later on began to deliberate this problem of killing, because it was first time in our life it happened. It was not nice experience, of course, but we came to inevitable, in our own opinion, conclusion that it's our job. Job has to be done. We have to defend city of Lvov, and that is why we are supposed to shoot at Ukrainians, and Ukrainians want to capture city of Lvov. They will shoot us, In war, it's normal.
Thousands of Jews also lived in Lvov. Most of them took no side in the battle. In the aftermath, some 70 Jews were killed by Polish troops. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas had been imprisoned and then murdered by the Bolsheviks. The German Kaiser had abdicated and retired to Holland. In Germany, the Communist Party urged an international revolution. A workers' Soviet was established in Berlin, then crushed. Its leaders, Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, were murdered. In Poland, Pilsudski was abandoning socialism.
Comrades, I rode on the red-painted tramcar of socialism as far as the stop called Independence, but there I alighted. I don't care about rightists or leftists. I've had them up my arse. I am for everyone. I care only about a government which can give Poland what she requires.
In elections to form a Polish government, the left polled a third of the votes. Right-wing supporters of Roman Dmowski obtained slightly more. As head of state and commander-in-chief, Pilsudski chose concert pianist Ignacy Paderewski as a non-party prime minister.
Szpaler ludzi niekończący się.
There was an unending crowd of people.
Przejeżdżał powozem.
He came from the castle in a carriage drawn by white horses,
I myśmy
and we cheered, "Long live Pilsudski."
tak
No one near us shouted, "Long live Paderewski." Just, "Long live Pilsudski." And Pilsudski saluted.
Pilsudski dispatched Prime Minister Paderewski to Paris, where a Polish National Committee led by Roman Dmowski still claimed to be the authentic voice of Poland. Paderewski's task was to bring the committee into harmony with events in Warsaw. Dmowski was convinced that with Allied help, he could shape a better Poland.
So Dmowski, who was a very good French and English speaker, spoke to the great 3 or 4 masters of the world. In the 5 hours, he explained his plan.
In Paris, the French Prime Minister, Georges Clemenceau, was playing host to scores of nationalities who were lobbying the Allied peace conference. Britain's Lloyd George had declared,
The war of the giants has ended. The quarrels of the pygmies have begun.
Said President Wilson,
People will endure their tyrants for years, but they tear their deliverers to pieces if a millennium is not created immediately.
The Great War was over, but in Russia there was no peace. The Bolsheviks, the Reds, were fighting a fratricidal war with the Whites. The feuding spread to the far corners of the old Russian Empire. Soon the Red Army was fighting not only a civil war, but also battles with the new Poland.
First time I heard about Polish and Bolshevik fights was in February 1919. There were still fights, of course, in the immediate surrounding of Lvov between Ukrainians and Poles, but we had already the official free press, and from that press I got the news about the fighting.
In one day, I remember there were 19 attacks back and forth. The Bolsheviks with the Poles. They used to run out of the house. Some of them came back, some of them didn't come back.
In France, Clemenceau declared that his government would rather resign than have the Bolshevik monsters at the Paris Peace Conference. The great powers regarded the Russian Civil War and the skirmishes with Poland as awkward and time-consuming. Their principal concerns were preparing for a peace treaty with Germany, setting up the League of Nations, and redrawing a tidier, more civilized map of Europe.
I had the privilege to sit at lunch with Professor Romer, the expert on geography, and Wacław Babiński, a diplomat, his wife, born a countess, a very self-willed, pretty woman who fascinated me because she took me on shopping trips, and I was fascinated by Les Parfums de Guerlain and the enormous hats on which I was spending my scarce earnings as translators.
Polish Prime Minister Paderewski was a popular and charming diplomat. He countered some of Roman Dmowski's extreme nationalist and anti-Semitic views. The Polish army Dmowski had organized with General Haller was still in France 6 months after the end of the Great War. The Allies feared that it might be used to seize Danzig from the Germans, or against the Ukrainians or Jews. It was April 1919 before the Allies let the army leave for Poland.
It was a bright day, and all of a sudden there was a crowd around and looking. I sort of pushed into the crowd to see what was going on, and there was a sheikhet. Those were the people that came to slaughter for kosher meats. and there were two halerchikes around him, and one held his beard and a knife in the other hand, and there was blood gushing from him. There were a lot of people around, but there wasn't anybody that protested.
Pilsudski was firmly opposed to anti-Semitism, but the question of a Polish national identity, after an eclipse of more than 100 years, inflamed the early days of Polish independence. Pilsudski sometimes declared himself not Polish, but Lithuanian. He was born north of Vilno, a city the Lithuanians claimed as theirs. In April 1919, the Polish army commandeered the city from local Bolsheviks. Pilsudski promised to govern without reference to race or creed. But Pilsudski had ignored edicts from the great powers, prohibiting the seizure of disputed territory by force. Poland's territorial designs and political capabilities attracted considerable criticism from Britain's Lloyd George. French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau favored a strong Poland. Having lost its Russian ally, France was seeking new alliances capable of containing Germany in the future. An independent Poland had been one of President Wilson's war aims. He backed Polish claims for Silesia and a seaport at Danzig, but during the Paris conference he grew cautious. The British Foreign Office warned that the award of Danzig to Poland could create instability and probably render the Polish position untenable if and when Germany recovers.
Lloyd George was, in fact, always opposing, you see, the important demand of the Moscow. The Gdańsk or Danzig must be Polish port without any control, because otherwise you are not free.
The Great War ended with ceremony and many peace treaties. In Paris, Poland claimed Lvov, so did the Ukrainians. Poland claimed Vilno, so did the Lithuanians. Poland claimed Teschen, so did the Czechs. Poland claimed Silesia and Danzig, so did the Germans. A humble Germany had agreed to peace terms, but Poland too had been forced to compromise. Poland was forced to waive claims to the port of Danzig, which was declared a free city. Poland was forced to accept a plebiscite that would decide the future of Silesia. The Allies insisted that Poland must sign a treaty guaranteeing minority rights. Poland was forced to agree that her eastern boundaries would be subject to international review. Whilst the conference recognized Poland's existence, its final shape and form was still undecided. Clemenceau of France, Wilson of the United States, Lloyd George of Britain, and Orlando of Italy had completed their business at Versailles. The world's mightiest peace conference was over. The great leaders departed, leaving issues of detail unresolved. The Bolsheviks viewed the Paris Peace Conference with contempt. Units of the Red Army were spreading westward. They claimed that only the overthrow of capitalism could bring peace to Europe. In the hinterland between Russia and Poland, more villages were coming under Bolshevik control.
Our population had very few Poles. Most of them were Jewish, Belarusian, White Russian, some Ukrainians. At that time, believe me, they didn't know a thing from communism or socialism, a peasant. They were illiterate, they couldn't even write.
Pilsudski hoped that to the east of Poland would be a federation of states free from Russian domination and dependent on Poland for survival. In the spring of 1920, such hopes looked dim. To the southeast of Poland, the Bolsheviks had advanced deep into the Ukraine. Pilsudski reached an agreement with the Ukrainian nationalist Petlura. Using the Polish army and remnants of Petlura's troops, they would march on Kiev and re-establish a Ukrainian republic. The Red Army melted away. The Polish forces arrived in Kiev with flowers in their rifle muzzles, but the Ukrainians paid scant attention. It was the 15th regime in 3 years. It lasted just 6 weeks. The attack on Kiev awakened Russian patriotism.
Soldiers of the Red Army to the west, the time of reckoning has come. Over the dead body of White Poland shines the road to worldwide conflagration. On our bayonets we shall bring happiness and peace to toiling humanity.
Over proceedings at the Communist International in Moscow hung a huge map recording the Red Army's advance. Lenin had abandoned caution. The spear of revolution would be carried by the Red Army through Poland into the heart of Europe.
To destroy White Poland is the duty of the hour.
Almost overnight, political divisions in Poland abated.
The fatherland is in need. The whole nation must resist like a solid, immovable wall. It is on our breasts that the flood of Bolshevism will be broken.
Altogether, during this war, about 1 million people came through the army in 1920.
I couldn't stand the stench of those wounds, of the sight of... well, anyway, I did not qualify to be a good nurse. And I was dismissed, and then I volunteered for the service as a courier.
I lied. I told them that I am 16, and they accepted 16-year-old boys, but not the 15, so I had to lie.
The Red Army drew closer. The solid, immovable wall sought by the Poles was elusive. Predominantly Roman Catholic, the population enrolled against an enemy many saw as the Antichrist. Pilsudski's military leadership came under increasing criticism from Roman Dmowski and his supporters. Dmowski predicted the collapse of Warsaw, but Pilsudski's offer to resign was refused, even though his army was still in retreat.
In 1 month, we take about 600 miles back. So it was catastrophe, really. And troops was exhausted.
During the day we fought, and during the night we tried to go back towards Warsaw, towards Warsaw, towards Warsaw.
Back and back and back, more and more demoralized the people. And people not only demoralized, but exhausted.
Convinced of victory, the Bolsheviks appointed a Polish Revolutionary Committee charged with laying the foundations of a Polish-Soviet Socialist Republic. The committee received virtually no support from the population.
We knew this was the enemy who was pushing its army forward in order to overrun Poland and take away our newly gained independence, just as the Tsars had done before.
Pilsudski ordered a strategic retreat. General Władysław Sikorski was entrusted with a vital defense line north of Warsaw. In a matter of days, Pilsudski and his general staff reorganized the army and planned a bold move designed to slice through and encircle the Reds. For 2 months, the Polish army had retreated, but on August the 15th, Sikorski's troops held their positions. The following day, Pilsudski counterattacked. Warsaw was saved. It was a miracle on the Vistula, declared the Warsaw Daily. The turnaround occurred as millions of Catholics celebrated the feast of the Assumption, the ascension of the Virgin Mary into heaven. The Bolshevik threat to Poland had imperiled the very existence of Western civilization, claimed a senior British diplomat in Warsaw. Remarked Lenin afterwards,
In the Red Army, the Poles saw enemies, not brothers and liberators.
In retreat, the Red Army's bayonets of peace and happiness brought more death. In the ensuing peace settlement, Poland's boundaries were extended beyond the Curzon line once suggested by the British. Pilsudski, though, was worried. Instead of friendly eastern neighbors, Poland faced a hostile Soviet regime.
After the Marshal Pilsudski victory in the famous battle at the Vistula River, we were dismissed, you know, and I returned again to school. And then in May 1921, a Silesian uprising broke out. So again, it was the same fellow with whom I escaped to defend Lvov. I went to Silesian uprising.
The Paris Peace Conference had resolved to settle the Polish-German disputes in Silesia by plebiscite. But fighting broke out before a vote had been cast.
Where the German entered, he shot the Pole. Where the Pole came, he massacred the German. It was a terrible, desperate battle among brothers.
After 2 Polish uprisings, the Allies sent in troops to keep the peace during the plebiscite which would decide Silesia's fate. From Germany, the government sent more than 180,000 Silesian Germans to take part in the ballot. The Germans obtained 706,000 votes. The Poles, 479,000. As the Allies prepared to divide up Silesia, the Poles organized a 3rd uprising. Whilst the government in Warsaw urged calm and restraint, 40,000 Poles went on the offensive, seizing German areas. From Germany came thousands of reinforcements for the Freikorps, paramilitary groups set on keeping Silesia German. They were not merely anti-Polish, they were anti-Semitic, anti-communist, and ruthless.
Here it was a kind of guerrilla warfare. The skirmishes, these battles, were very bloody. You know, why? Because Germans didn't take our people prisoners. They shot them on the spot.
My brothers were walking to the station and had to pass the inn where the Polish insurgents were. My brothers were attacked. They escaped into the church, then through the back door to the orphanage. But there they were trapped. They were murdered. One could not recognize them.
The 3rd Silesian uprising ended in a Polish triumph. The Allies agreed to new boundary revisions. The Germans lost control of industrial Silesia.
One day, suddenly, it was a great commotion. It turned out that armistice was concluded. And then I and 3 colleagues of mine, we suddenly recalled that on Monday, the final examination is going to start in our school. So we went to our commander and we told him, can we get a furlough to go to our school? And he said, sure, boys, no more fighting, no more war, no more uprising. Go back to school and try to get your diploma.
In 1923, the great powers confirmed the borders of the new Polish state. Poland was flanked by hostile neighbors. But after more than 120 years, the seemingly impossible had happened. Poland was independent.
techniques themselves are complex and